Hey there, everyone. We are talking about central business districts tonight. This is our fourth lecture for cities and urban land use. Here we go. The central business district is a very important concept for this class. It is certainly something that I would anticipate you seeing on the multiple choice portion of the AP exam. And it may be the kind of concept that could be incorporated into a larger free response question. So it's definitely an important element. And that's mainly our focus tonight. So here is our definition. Central Business District, or CBD, is the downtown or nucleus of an urban area. It is marked by high density land use, high land values, the convergence of mass transit systems, the tallest buildings, and is traditionally the major concentration of retail, office, and cultural activity. Now, in reading through that definition, I want you to try and identify the really important elements. And even beyond just identifying the really important elements, can you explain why they are that way? For example, I'll give you a for instance. One of the really important elements of that definition is high land value. Can you explain why land values are so high in the central business district? Now, we're going to discuss this throughout the lecture tonight, but being able to critically think about this is going to be an important element of this. All right. So here we go. Let's get into some of the characteristics of this CBD. The central business district is going to have certain types of services associated with it. We're going to see high threshold and high range, what we call higher order services. Now, as a bit of review and to review some vocabulary terms, when we say high threshold, what does that mean? When we say high range, what does that mean? Right, so reviewing some vocabulary terms. In addition to that, we're also going to see that the central business district is going to have provide services for office workers. We're going to see very specific services here like financial services, legal services, governmental services, so what we classify as public services. And what I would like you to do on this particular slide is try and come up with an example for each one of these. So what is an example of a high threshold retail service? What is an example of a service for office workers? What's an example of a legal service? Those types of things. So we have some more specifics when it comes to what we see in central business districts. So I want you to come up with an example for each one of those. Now, central business districts are not the same all across the planet. And so in this case, we're going to compare and contrast central business districts in North America. More specifically, we should say Anglo-America. So that might be one minor adjustment you want to make on here is Anglo-America, not North America. And European central business districts. So let's get started with the types of buildings that we're likely to see here. In North American central business districts and Anglo-American central business districts, we're going to see they're very much characterized by skyscrapers, tall buildings. Typically from anywhere in the city, you would be able to see the central business district and kind of know that that is the hub of the city. In fact, skyscrapers are really unique when it comes to services because you're actually going to see different services provided at different levels of the skyscraper. On the ground floor of the skyscraper, you're likely to see typically high range, high threshold retail services because that's where you're going to get a lot more foot traffic. As you start to move up the floors, you're going to get more of the office activities, so still very accessible, which is one really important element of the central business district, and so those mid-level floors are going to be very accessible. And then you get up into the higher end of this skyscraper, the top floors, and we're going to see residential services up there. So we're going to see apartments and things like that. Now, to be clear, getting to our next point, relatively few people live in the central business district, and that is because the land values are so incredibly high, and so it tends to be very, very expensive to live in the central business district. Not to say that people don't, uh, but it tends to be very expensive. We tend to see newer structures, at least relatively new structures there, um, in Anglo American central business districts. Very few parks, very few supermarkets, because there just aren't that many people there. And this allows us to reincorporate an element that we mentioned back in agriculture, and that is a food desert. So, make a little note about that. We're going to take a look at that on the upcoming slides. In addition, you're going to see more cars because since people don't live there, they have to commute in. So you're going to see modes of transportation that are going to help facilitate that. Obviously, the city itself is going to vary, or different cities vary in terms of how people get into this central business district. For example, you take New York City, Lower Manhattan, the financial district, which would be the central business district, and they obviously have the subway system. But uh, typically, we're going to see more cars because people have to commute in. In addition to that, we're also going to see the city laid out in a particular way. A lot of times in Anglo America, we're going to see more of like a grid like pattern in terms of streets and city blocks. If you've ever been to New York City, uh, you can number all of the streets, and you can give a cross street, and it's very, very systematic. It's grid like, very easy to get around there, very easy to navigate. It may seem intimidating, but it's really not too bad. Let's flip to the other side of this, the European side of this. In really, we're talking opposites here. So in the North American or Anglo American Central Business District, we're going to have skyscrapers. In Europe, we're going to have more low-rise buildings. Uh, and really, there's a great example of this. In Paris, France, one of the reasons they started to build high rises near the Central Business District, downtown, the historic downtown, and people were very upset. People got really upset. And I want you to perhaps try and think, okay, cultural landscape, what do you think would be in the downtown area of Paris, France, that people might be upset about looking at high rises instead of what they had been looking at? So ponder that for a moment. We're also going to tend to see more people downtown, especially that's the more desirable location. More people wanting to live downtown because that tends to be the cultural hub. We're also going to see some older structures, some as old as medieval times. The buildings can be quite a bit older. We are going to see more parks. We're going to see other elements that people need to live on a daily basis. So butchers, bakers, supermarkets, things like that. And as far as a vocabulary term that I'd like you to tie in here, uh, I would like you to mention green belts because you are going to see more green space set aside. Now, typically, and when we talk about green belts, again, we'll be talking about it with regards to urban sprawl. And then finally, you're going to see relatively few cars. Not a lot of cars because the cities, many of them were set up prior to the invention of automobiles. And the growth of the city had happened prior to the development of automobiles. In fact, streets in Europe are laid out very much like the roots of a tree. You're going to have like one main thoroughfare, and then shooting off of it, a lot of smaller, minor streets and side streets and things like that. Can be very, very confusing to try and get around. So let's take a look at an image. First question I'll ask you is this image from North America or from Europe? Is this a North American Central Business District or a European one? And then, more importantly, how do you know that? What elements are you looking at in this picture to discern that this is, in fact, from one area or another? And again, this is where we can incorporate elements like the cultural landscape. And this is something that I feel fairly confident on. You could be asked a question on the AP exam that you could be given some kind of image and you have to analyze that image and determine where in the world you think this is. So in this case, asking the question, where is this particular central business district? And the answer in this case is that this is Manhattan in New York City. So this is a Anglo-American central business district, and more specifically the the interior part of Manhattan. So let's ask you a similar question that we just asked. Is this an Anglo-American or European central business district? And I think this is fairly obviously a European central business district. And to go back to the question I posed a few minutes ago with regards to Paris, France, why do you think Parisians were upset when it was mentioned that high rises were going to start being built in their central business district? And when you look at it, it obstructs the view of the Eiffel Tower. And so that is something that, especially when you have a historic component to your city, you can see it's very, very low level buildings. Notice where the skyscrapers are. They are far removed from the central business district. And that is very much something that is characteristic of most European CBDs. So this gives us an opportunity to review a little bit about food deserts. We talked about it back in agriculture. We mentioned it just a couple minutes ago. A food desert is an area characterized by a lack of affordable, fresh, and nutritious food. And we typically see food deserts in very rural areas as well as inner city areas, uh, particularly industrial areas and CBDs, things like that. And we mentioned that back in our agriculture unit, but let's review because our grocery stores, how would you characterize the range and threshold of grocery stores? Are they high? Are they low? Are people willing to drive or travel long distances for it? How many people do you need? And it should be noted that when discussing range and threshold, competition affects your range and threshold. So when we're talking about grocery stores, what competition do we have to be concerned with? What might offer alternatives to grocery stores? Now, obviously, other grocery stores would be a potential answer, but I'm thinking other than grocery stores. Where else might you be able to get food that might be competition for grocery stores? And when it comes to those competitors, is their range higher or lower than grocery stores? And is their threshold higher or lower than grocery stores? So, as an example, convenience stores, that is competition. And is the range higher or lower? Is the threshold higher or lower? How is that going to affect their spatial distribution? How is that going to affect accessibility to people who need food? And then finally, the next question, the final question that I have regarding food deserts is how does transportation impact the development of food deserts? So, different modes of transportation. How does that impact the development of food deserts? If everyone has a car, is that more likely or less likely to produce a food desert? If everyone is walking or riding a bus or bicycles or subways, how does that affect that? I want you to ponder that as we look at our next map. So here's the question that I want to ask on here. First off, typical questions. What kind of map are we looking at here? And at what scale are we looking at? Now, how would you characterize the spatial distribution of food deserts? So this is looking at no cars and no supermarkets within 1 mile and percentage of the population that fits into those characteristics. How would you describe the spatial distribution of these food deserts? Where across the United States would we see these? Now, compare this map to other maps that we've seen throughout the year. Does this map look familiar or look similar to maps that we looked at when we talked about ethnicity? Does this map look similar to maps that we've discussed with income? And the reason that I ask these questions is because I'm asking, in other words, does it appear if any group of people is more disproportionately affected by food deserts? And how might not having access to affordable, fresh, and nutritious food impact other aspects of your life? Impact work, impact education? How might that affect that? So it's just something to ponder about because I don't know that there's any one definitive answer to that, but it is something to think about and to see if perhaps there's any correlation between those. As we shift gears now to a new topic, talking about functional zonation, uh, here's our definition: the division of a city into different regions or zones for certain purposes or functions. So, functional zonation, it sounds like a really fancy word, but it just means that we have zones with different functions. That's all it is. So, whether we're talking about residential and housing or industrial and manufacturing, that's what we're talking about. And so essentially, it is this idea that we have to plan our cities or that there is a plan for our cities. And do we necessarily want to be living next to a big giant factory? Well, probably not. And so the question on this slide that I would like you to ponder is where do you think industry and residential would be in relationship to one another? Because what we're going to find out is that neither of those, industrial or residential, are found in central business districts. So we know that they have to be further away from the city center. So where are they going to be? Which one's closer to the city center? Which one's further away? Why? So again, as we pointed out just a moment ago, there are a few activities that we're just very unlikely to see in the central business district, and you can probably speculate as to why. Manufacturing, because of the high land cost in the central business district, as well as better transportation systems, manufacturing does not need to be located in the CBD. Now, historically, has that always been the case? Have we seen industries located in cities? And at what point in human history did we see that, and why? And then why have things changed? What has changed to lead industry, our secondary sector, away from the interior parts of cities? And then residential, because it is very expensive to live in the central business district, you're just not going to see a lot of people there. Now, as a bit of review, that's in a particular region of the world. What region of the world are we not going to see a lot of people living in the central business district? Because to be clear, in another region of the world that we just looked at a few minutes ago, there are plenty of people living in the CBD, and that's the desirable place to get to. So where are we talking about when we talk about the lack of residential in CBDs? Now, the reason for what we just explained, the lack of manufacturing and residential in central business districts, is a direct product of what we call bid rent. Now, I'd put a star next to this because this is something that I would anticipate, at the very least, a multiple choice question on the AP exam. What bid rent says is that the price of a piece of land is directly related to its usefulness. Now, we say directly related means it has a positive correlation. And as a bit of review, a positive correlation means that as one element increases, so too does the other element. So in this case, as usefulness increases, as a piece of land is viewed as being more useful, its price goes up as well. And so as you can see on the image there to the right, the different types of industries that need to have more useful land. And in this case, usefulness is typically associated with accessibility, so more accessibility. Um, as we can see in the image, the areas that have to have more accessible, that need to be more accessible, are located closer to the city center. They're willing to pay more to be more accessible. So high volume retail, for example, is going to be located closer to the city center because it needs to be more accessible. It has high ranges, high thresholds, so we're going to see them there. Whereas residential doesn't necessarily need to be more accessible. It can be anywhere. You could live anywhere. Um, it doesn't affect so much, your income, I guess. Um, and so we can move that further out. You don't, as long as there's a transportation system that takes you that far out. Now, let's continue talking a little bit about residential. This is an image looking at urban housing patterns. And the reality is we see a variety of different housing patterns throughout urban areas. Now, some of these you might be more familiar with, like apartments and single family detached homes. Other ones you might be less familiar with, like row houses or duplexes. And so we're going to look at each of these. So, first off, let's start by examining the image. Uh, right at the intersection of the X and Y axis, we have the central business district. And so along the x-axis, we have distance from the city center. Along the y-axis, we have population density. So what we see is that population density is lower at the central business district, again, because most of that land is occupied by commercial activities, high volume retail. That land is too expensive, and the people who are willing to pay more money based on bid rent are the ones who need to have the accessibility. So fewer residential there. That is going to increase as you get further away from the city center, and you're going to see high density, particularly like apartment buildings. You're going to get a lot of people per unit of land. And as we talk about models of urban land use, this is going to make a lot more sense. Then we're going to start to see, row houses where these buildings are very close proximity, oftentimes touching one another. Then we get duplexes, which almost look like a single family detached home, but really it's going to be two families there. Then we get into the suburbs and we start talking about single family detached homes, and the population density is significantly lower. So, the last question that I want to ask before we look at each of these different types of housing is, how does density and concentration change with each of these different types of houses? Which ones are going to be higher density? That one's actually on the graphic. Which ones are going to be lower density? Which ones are going to be higher concentration? Which ones are going to be lower concentration? And then how do you think that affects day-to-day life, living in high density or low density areas, being closer or further away from the city center? What do we think about that? So we've got some images here on this particular slide. In the upper left-hand corner, we can see an apartment building, so multiple stories in this case, multiple families in one particular building. And so this is something that has been confusing for students in the past, because typically they say, well, wait a minute, isn't closer to the city center going to be higher, is going to be more expensive based on bid rent? Well, yes, but also remember that we're talking about multiple families in one building. And so that cost of being closer to the city center is diffused throughout multiple families, keeping that price a little bit lower. So these tend to be lower in terms of cost. And then in the bottom right, we can see row houses. And so what I would like you to do for each of these different styles of buildings is kind of describe what are some of the characteristics that you know. So for example, we mentioned for the apartments, multiple stories. For the row houses, we've got, individual residences, but they're all touching each other. So higher density and things like that. So, what are some other characteristics or descriptions that we could incorporate for each of these different types of buildings? Once again, we want to ask the question, what are some characteristics, what are some descriptions that you can note from here? Now, duplexes, which are in the upper left-hand corner there, uh, as the name kind of suggests, two. You can see the two front doors there. This is actually one building, two different families in their two own separate residences. And then in the bottom right, that is going to be kind of an example of a single family home, detached home. It goes by a variety of different names, so just kind of be familiar with each of those. So once again, what are some other characteristics that we can use, other descriptions in examining these images that we could include? So on this particular slide, we see a very similar image to what we looked at a few slides ago, because we've got on the y-axis population density, on the x-axis distance, and right at the center point, the central business district. But this looks at change over time. So we can ask different questions based on that. So let's start in 1900. Notice that in the central business district, we've got lots of people. So we've got urban living, and we're not seeing as many people away from the city center. Now, as a bit of review, I would like to ask, what stage of Rostoy's model are we in at this particular point? In the far left image A, 1900, what stage of Rostoy's model are we in? And let's make sure that we use the actual formal title. If you need to, recall your mnemonic device, whatever it was that we came up with in your class. Um, what stage do you think we would be in? More people living in cities. We haven't seen the rapid suburbanization yet. That then starts to come in part B, 1950. We see suburbanization, so we have moved out of the previous stage of Rostoy's model and now into what stage? Again, make sure that you use that specific title. And then finally, again, in part C, very similar to what the image that we just looked at, let's make mention, you see all those different bumps, that's going to account for different types of housing. So whether we're talking about apartments or row houses, duplexes, single family homes. And so we're going to see some variation there. It's not just as standard. You go back to part A, it looks very much like the distance decay model. But by the time you get to part C, really not that. Right? A lot more variation. Now, one of the last things that I want to talk about today is tying this all together. And this is the tapestry segmentation. And I actually have a poster of this in our classroom. I would encourage you to check it out because it's really, really neat. There's so much information on this. And ESRI, which is, I would say, probably the leading GIS company, bit of a review. What does GIS stand for? What does it do? And ESRI created the tapestry segmentation using census data. And the census is just incredibly wide, as we're going to highlight on the next slide. What they came up with was 14 different life modes, and you can see the key in the bottom right-hand corner there, with 67 different segments. And each of these are a little bit different. So let's take a look at some examples. So on this slide, this is the tapestry segmentation. And I want to ask, how accurate do you think this is? How accurate do you think we can describe the population of a particular area just based on its census data, just by looking at essentially a poll, a survey? How accurate do you think we can describe them? Now, before you answer that, you may be wondering, well, what is some of the data that is incorporated into this? That's an important question to answer. So here are some of the different elements, and you can kind of see some of them on the far left-hand side there that go into every single tapestry segmentation. So we've got things like household type, the median age, income, employment, level of education, type of residential housing we see, race and ethnicity, and then along with a host of other things that are factored into this. So once again, let's ask the question, how accurate do you think this will be? Because we're going to start to apply this. So let's take a look at how this tapestry segmentation is spatially distributed. So first thing, let's call attention to our different life modes. Over there on your left-hand side, you got things like high society, scholars and patriots, the American quilt. So you've got a variety of different terms, and each group has different subsections, and those are the different 67 tapestry segmentations, and each segment has a lot of characteristics that go into it, as we'll point out on the next slide. Let's ask the usual questions. What type of map are we looking at? And at what scale? Now, be careful with that scale question because this one's a little bit different. So be careful with that. You might have to look kind of close to figure that one out. Now, what I'd like you to do is anytime we're introducing kind of a new topic, new concept, let's look for any patterns that emerge. So let's look at our local area and start out with Clark County as well as the larger state of Nevada. Is there anything that you kind of notice about our neck of the woods? Anything that, how would we describe the life mode of Clark County, of Nevada? And then, are there any larger patterns that you see emerging across the country? Certain life modes in certain regions of the country. And what do you think? Because again, we haven't looked at the details of this yet. What do you think that says about that area? So, we look at the American South and we see a lot of factories and farms. What do you think that says about them? We see the Northeast, what would actually be kind of the Boswash megalopolis, a lot of high society as well as upscale avenues. What do you think that says about them? Where do you think we're going to see the metropolis life mode? And how do you think that life mode would look based on census data? And so let's take a look at this. This is the tapestry segmentation for 89052, where Coronado High School is located. And the most numerous tapestry segmentation at 14% is silver and gold. So this is a particular segment. And for each segment, they have a plethora of census data. So here is just the introduction for silver and gold. And I want to see, do you agree with this? Because the data says this is the group that is most numerous in 89052. So here's the description for silver and gold. Almost the oldest senior market, second to the elders, the difference of 10 years in median age reveals a socioeconomic difference. This is the most affluent senior market and is still growing. The affluence of silver and gold has afforded the opportunity to retire to sunnier climates that feature exclusive communities and vacation homes. These consumers have the free time, stamina, and resources to enjoy the good life. That's silver and gold. So, based on all of this data, how would you describe 89052? How would we describe it demographically? How would you describe it using the type of residential housing? How would you describe it using income and socioeconomic status? How would you use it or describe it using things like race and ethnicity? So I want you to ponder that because this is something that we will bring back up as we move into class and as we start looking at the way that cities are laid out. So I'll see you guys in class. Thank you very much. Have a good night.